A 30-year-old woman discovered her husband's terrible secret, and this secret cost her not only her happiness and her future, but also her very ability to see the world. Beaverton is a small town in western Oregon, located just a few kilometers from Portland. About 100,000 people live here, mostly middle-class families who work for tech companies in Silicon Forest or in the service industry. Quiet streets with neat houses, well-kept lawns, playgrounds, and small parks create an atmosphere of calm and safety. Local residents know each other by sight, greet each other on the streets, and discuss the weather and the latest news at their mailboxes. It was here, on Maple Street, in a two-story house with gray siding and white shutters, that Melanie and Kyle White lived. Melanie Lee White was born in June 1987 to a schoolteacher and a nurse. From childhood, she dreamed of becoming an artist, painted watercolor landscapes and portraits, and participated in local exhibitions. After graduating from high school in Eugene, she enrolled at the Portland Art Institute, where she studied graphic design. It was there, in her third year, that she met Kyle White at a party thrown by mutual friends. Kyle worked as a systems administrator at a small IT company and was a quiet, somewhat reserved, but attentive young man. Melanie's friends noted that he seemed reliable and caring, though a bit boring. They dated for 2 years before having a modest wedding in Melanie's parents' garden in October 2010. The first years of their marriage seemed quite happy. The couple rented an apartment in Portland. Melanie worked as a freelancer, creating logos and web designs for small businesses, and Kyle got a promotion and became the head of the IT department at a trading company. In 2014, they saved up for a down payment and bought a house in Beaverton, dreaming of children and a quiet family life. Their neighbors remembered them as a quiet, unremarkable couple. Melanie often worked in the small studio they had set up in the garage, while Kyle spent a lot of time in his office on the second floor, where he had 3 monitors and a powerful computer necessary for his work. But behind the closed doors of their home lay a terrible secret. A secret that Melanie had no idea about until October 2018. October 23, 2018 was cold and rainy. An autumn storm brought strong winds and heavy rain to Oregon, pounding on the roofs of houses and turning the streets into streams of dirty water. Melanie was working at home on an order for a local restaurant, creating a new menu. Her husband Kyle left for work early in the morning, around 7 o'clock as usual. He said he had an important meeting with clients and would probably be back late in the evening. Around noon, Melanie's computer froze, so she decided to use Kyle's computer, which was in his office. She turned on one of the monitors and opened her browser to check her email, but she accidentally clicked on the wrong tab and saw the browser history. What she discovered made her blood run cold. Hundreds, if not thousands, of links. They all led to websites with illegal content related to exploitation, video files with horrific titles, forums where all these horrors were discussed, encrypted chats on the dark web. The browsing history spanned months, maybe even years. Melanie felt the room start to spin around her. Nausea rose in her throat. Her hands shook so badly that she could barely hold the mouse. She spent almost an hour in the office, scrolling through page after page, hoping to find some explanation, some mistake. Maybe it was a virus? Maybe someone had hacked into Kyle's computer? But the more she looked, the more obvious it became. This was no accident. The search queries were too specific. The bookmarks were organized into folders. Some files had been downloaded to an external hard drive, which she found in a desk drawer. Melanie reached for her phone. Her fingers barely obeyed her as she dialed the police. But she stopped. This was her husband, the man she had spent 8 years with, the man who kissed her goodnight and made breakfast on weekends. Maybe she should talk to him first. Maybe there was some explanation. She knew there couldn't be, but fear, shock, and denial made her put off the call. Instead, she took a few screenshots. She photographed the screen on her phone. She copied several files onto a flash drive she found in her bag. She didn't know what she was going to do, but her instinct told her to gather evidence. Kyle came home around 8 in the evening. The rain had stopped by then, but the sky remained covered with heavy gray clouds. Melanie met him at the door. Her face was pale, her eyes red from crying. She told him she had found his browser history. She said she had seen everything, and she said she was going to call the police right now if he didn't explain what was going on. Kyle's reaction was strange. He didn't deny it. He didn't try to justify himself. He just stared at her silently for a few seconds, and something cold, something alien appeared in his eyes, something Melanie had never seen before in the man she considered her husband. Then he said very calmly that she shouldn't have gone through his computer, that it was stupid of her, and that now he had no choice. Melanie remembered only fragments of what happened next, like scraps of a nightmare. Kyle stepped toward her, and she tried to back away, but he was faster. He grabbed her arm, spun her around, and pinned her against the wall in the hallway. Melanie tried to scream, but he covered her mouth with his hand. With his other hand, he took something small and plastic out of his jacket pocket. She heard a click and felt a prick in her neck. Everything around her began to blur. The last thing she remembered was Kyle's face leaning over her, and his voice saying something about her not sticking her nose where it didn't belong. When Melanie regained consciousness, she couldn't understand where she was. It was completely dark. Her head was splitting with pain, and her body wouldn't obey her. She tried to move, and realized she was sitting in a chair with her arms and legs tightly bound with thick rope. She wanted to scream, but her mouth was gagged with a piece of cloth tied tightly behind her head. Panic washed over her heart pounding so hard she thought it would burst out of her chest. Then the light came on. A dim bulb illuminated the basement of their house. Melanie recognized the place. They rarely came down here, using the basement only to store old things and holiday decorations. But now the space looked different. In the corner stood a folding table with tools on it. Melanie was horrified to see kitchen knives, pliers, and some kind of medical clamps. Next to it was a glass jar, half filled with a clear liquid. Rolls of plastic wrap and packs of paper towels lay on the floor. Kyle came down the stairs. He was wearing an old t-shirt and jeans, which he usually wore for gardening. He had latex gloves on his hands, bought at a pharmacy. He looked at Melanie without any emotion, as if she were not his wife, but simply an object that needed to be dealt with. He told her he was very sorry that it had ended this way. He said he loved her in his own way, but she had forced him to do what he was going to do. She had threatened to ruin his life. She wanted to send him to prison, and he couldn't let that happen. He had plans. He had a job. He had a reputation. And some woman, even if she was his wife, had no right to destroy all that. Melanie tried to speak through the gag, begged with her eyes, shook her head desperately. But Kyle didn't even seem to notice her pleas. He walked over to the table and picked up one of the knives, a kitchen knife with a long, narrow blade that Melanie used to cut vegetables. He held the blade up to the light, checking its sharpness. What happened next is impossible to describe without shuddering. Kyle told Melanie that he was going to teach her a lesson about what happens to people who see things they shouldn't see. And since she had seen what she shouldn't have seen, she would never see anything again. He didn't use anesthesia. He didn't give her any painkillers. He simply walked up to her, held her head in place with his free arm around her back, and began to cut. Melanie's screams were muffled by the gag. The pain was so excruciating, so all-consuming, that she lost consciousness after a few seconds. But Kyle brought her back to her senses by pouring cold water into her mouth and slapping her cheek, and he continued his terrible work. The procedure took almost an hour. Kyle worked methodically, as if performing a routine task. When he was done, Melanie's eyeballs were lying on a plastic sheet spread out on the table. He rinsed them thoroughly with water, then placed them in a glass jar of formaldehyde, which he had ordered online in advance under the guise of biological material for educational purposes. He placed the jar on a shelf where it would be at eye level if someone were sitting on a chair in the center of the basement. Melanie was in shock. The pain had turned into a kind of numbness, cold and frightening. Blood oozed from her empty eye sockets, which Kyle wiped away with paper towels. He treated the wounds with antiseptic and applied gauze bandages, demonstrating a frightening competence in medical procedures. Then another form of torture began. Kyle brought a mirror, a regular hand mirror that had previously been in the bathroom. He removed Melanie's gag and blindfold. Then he held the mirror up to her face, where her eyes used to be, and told her that now she would see herself in a new way. he said it was only fair. She wanted to see the truth about him, so now she would see the truth about herself. Of course, Melanie could no longer see anything. Her empty eye sockets could not reflect the image in the mirror, but Kyle seemed to take perverse pleasure in this ritual. He repeated it every day. He came to the basement, removed the bandages, held the mirror to her face, and told her to look at what she had become, to look at the consequences of her curiosity. Logic suggested that it would be safer to kill the witness and get rid of the body, but Kyle White's psychology did not obey ordinary logic. For him, Melanie in the basement was not just a problem that needed to be eliminated, but a trophy. The highest manifestation of his power. Every time he went downstairs, he reassured himself, "I control your life, your death, and even your darkness." This drug of power proved stronger than his instinct for self-preservation. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. Melanie lost track of time. There were no windows in the basement, no natural light. She didn't know if it was day or night, a weekday or a weekend. Kyle fed her by force, pouring liquid nutrition through her mouth with a large syringe, pinching her nose to make her swallow. He ordered special liquid food online, pretending to be someone caring for a sick relative. Twice a day, he poured a mixture containing the necessary calories and nutrients into her mouth. It was enough to keep Melanie from starving to death, but not enough to keep her healthy. She was losing weight every day. Her muscles were atrophying from immobility. Her skin was covered with bed sores where the ropes cut into her flesh. The wounds in her eye sockets had healed but left ugly scars. Her hair was matted and covered in dirt. She urinated and defecated on herself, and Kyle periodically washed her with cold water from a hose, as if she were an animal in a cage. Melanie's psychological state was deteriorating as rapidly as her physical condition. Isolation, darkness, pain, humiliation, all of this broke her will to resist. She no longer screamed. She hardly cried. She just existed in a kind of stupor, in a borderline state between life and death. Sometimes she heard Kyle talking to someone upstairs, probably on the phone or with colleagues who sometimes came to see him to discuss work issues. The voices sounded muffled, coming through the thick ceiling, and no one suspected that just a few meters below them, a woman was slowly dying. Kyle continued to live his normal life. He went to work, socialized with his neighbors, and bought groceries at the supermarket. When someone asked about Melanie, he said that she had gone to stay with her parents for a few months because her mother was seriously ill and needed care. He said this calmly and convincingly. No one questioned his words. No one checked his story. Melanie's parents did try to contact their daughter. Her mother, Janice Lee, called Melanie's cell phone, but it was turned off. Kyle explained that Melanie had dropped her phone in water and was now using an old phone that had reception problems. He promised to tell her that her parents had called. A week later, he called Janice himself and said that Melanie was very busy with a new project and would contact them as soon as she was free. Janice sensed that something was wrong, but she couldn't figure out what it was. She discussed it with her husband, Roger, but he reassured her, saying that their adult daughter had a right to her privacy. Time passed. October turned into November, November into December. New Year's Eve was approaching, and Melanie's parents expected their daughter to come home for the holidays as usual. But Kyle called them on December 23rd and said that Melanie had caught the flu and was feeling very ill, so they would not be able to come. He conveyed his apologies and wishes for a speedy recovery. Janice felt anxious again, but what could she do? They lived in Eugene, 2 hours' drive from Beaverton. She had planned to visit her daughter after the holidays, but each time Kyle found a reason to postpone the visit. By mid-January 2019, Janice could no longer bear the uncertainty. She got in her car and drove to Beaverton without telling Kyle she was coming. When she rang the doorbell at the house on Maple Street, Kyle opened the door with a surprised look on his face. He said Melanie wasn't home. She had gone to Portland to meet with a client. Janice asked if she could come in and wait for her daughter, but Kyle politely declined, saying that the house was a mess and he wasn't ready to have guests. He promised that Melanie would call her mother that evening. Janice left, but her sense of unease only grew stronger. Something about Kyle's behavior was wrong. He was too tense, too insistent in his desire not to let her into the house. That evening, Janice called the Beaverton Police Department and asked them to check on her daughter's well-being. She explained that she had been unable to contact Melanie for several months and was very worried. Officer Mark Campbell of the Beaverton Police Department arrived at Maple Street on January 19th. He knocked on the White's door, and Kyle answered again. Campbell explained the reason for his visit and asked to see Melanie. Kyle said his wife had left again, this time to stay with a friend in Salem for the weekend. He took out his phone and unlocked the screen for a second, waving it in front of the officer's face. Campbell caught a glimpse of a text message in which Melanie allegedly wrote that she would be staying with her friend until Monday. Kyle quickly put his phone back in his pocket. Campbell, having no legal grounds to insist on searching the house without a warrant or clear evidence of a crime, did not look closely at the date of the message. This small oversight gave Kyle 9 more days of freedom and Melanie 9 days of hell. The officer wrote down the information and left. In his report, he indicated that the inspection had revealed no cause for concern, but Janice was not reassured. She called Melanie's friend, Sarah Thompson, whom she had been friends with since college. Sarah said she hadn't seen Melanie in several months and hadn't heard from her. Now Janice was sure something had happened to her daughter. She contacted the police again, this time insisting on a more thorough investigation. She said that Kyle was lying and that her daughter was in danger. Detective Emily Harris from the Homicide Division took control of the case. She interviewed Kyle on January 24th, this time at the police station. Kyle remained calm and confident. He repeated his version of events. Melanie often traveled for work. She was a freelancer and met with clients in different cities. The last time he saw her was on January 22nd, when she left for Salem. Harris asked to see proof of Melanie's trips, and Kyle provided his wife's credit card transaction history, which showed purchases in various locations in Oregon. What Harris did not know was that Kyle had made these purchases himself, using Melanie's card to make it appear as if she had been active. Harris also checked Melanie's phone. It turned out that the last activity was recorded on October 23, 2018. After that date, the phone was turned off and never connected again. This was strange, but it did not necessarily indicate a crime. Many people lose or break their phones. Nevertheless, Harris felt that something was wrong here. She obtained a search warrant for the Whites' home. On January 28th, a group of officers arrived at Maple Street. Kyle opened the door, maintaining outward calm, although inside he must have been panicking. The search began on the first floor. The officers checked the living room, kitchen, and bathroom. Everything looked clean and tidy, nothing suspicious. Then they went upstairs, the bedroom, Kyle's study, the bathroom. They confiscated the computer from the study for further analysis. But they found no obvious signs of a crime. Finally, one of the officers, David Reyes, went down to the basement door. The door was locked. When Reyes demanded the key, Kyle, who was sitting in the living room under the supervision of another officer, merely shrugged indifferently. His face took on an expression of indifference bordering on apathy. He understood that this was the end. Reyes did not wait and kicked the door open with a powerful blow. The lock gave way and the door swung open. The air rising from the basement was musty and heavy, with a sweetish, unpleasant smell. Reyes slowly descended the steps, illuminating the space with a flashlight. What he saw made him cry out and jump back. In the center of the basement, tied to a chair, sat a woman. Her body was emaciated to the point of being skeletal, her skin covered with sores and dirt. Her hair had become a tangled mess. But the most terrifying thing was her eyes, or rather, their absence. Empty, scarred eye sockets stared into nothingness. The woman did not move or react to the light. Reyes thought for a moment that she was dead, but then he noticed a faint, almost imperceptible movement of her chest. She was breathing. Reyes shouted, calling his colleagues. Within a minute, all the officers, including Detective Harris, were in the basement. They stood frozen in shock, unable to believe what they were seeing. Harris immediately called an ambulance. Then she approached the woman and gently touched her shoulder. Melanie, because it was her, trembled slightly. Harris quietly told her that she was safe, that help was on the way, that it was all over. Kayla White was immediately arrested. He did not resist. he did not try to run away. He just stood silently in the living room while the officers handcuffed him. There was no fear or remorse on his face, only a kind of emptiness, a cold indifference. Melanie was taken to St. Vincent's Hospital in Portland. Her condition was critical. Dehydration, exhaustion, multiple infections, third-degree bed sores. The doctors weren't sure if she would survive, but somehow her body was strong enough. 3 days later, she regained consciousness. Melanie's mental state was completely destroyed. She couldn't speak. She couldn't respond to questions. She just lay in bed, facing the wall, and cried quietly. Psychiatrists diagnosed her with severe post-traumatic stress disorder, dissociative disorder, and deep depression. She was transferred to a psychiatric clinic in Oregon, where she was under round-the-clock supervision. Melanie White's story shocked not only Beaverton, but the entire state. Local and national media picked up the story, calling it one of the most brutal cases of domestic violence and torture in Oregon's modern history. The Whites' neighbors told reporters that they never suspected that such horror was taking place just a few meters from their homes. They said that Kyle seemed like a completely normal person, a little withdrawn, but polite and non-confrontational. A search of the house and analysis of Kyle's computer revealed the extent of his criminal activity. Tens of thousands of files were found on his hard drives. Forensic experts also found dozens of video tutorials for nurses in his browser history. How to treat purulent wounds, how to care for bedridden patients, how to feed people who are unable to eat on their own. He did not treat Melanie out of compassion. He serviced her like a broken machine, simply to prevent her from breaking down completely before he finished his game. Forensic experts determined that Kyle had been actively collecting prohibited material for at least 5 years, starting in 2013. He participated in closed darknet forums where users exchanged such content. Some files were dated just weeks before his arrest, meaning he continued his criminal activity even after mutilating and imprisoning his wife. The Federal Bureau of Investigation got involved in the case because Kyle's crimes fell under federal jurisdiction. Special Agent Robert Chen, who specializes in child sexual exploitation cases, led the investigation. Chen and his team tracked Kyle's activity on the dark web and were able to identify several other members of the criminal network. Thanks to this information, several more people were arrested in different states, although none of them had committed crimes comparable in severity to those of Kyle White. Kyle White's trial began in September 2019. Washington County Prosecutor Linda McMillan presented charges on multiple counts: attempted murder, unlawful imprisonment, grievous bodily harm, torture, and possession and distribution of child sexual exploitation material. The list of charges took up several pages. Kyle's defense team tried to portray him as a person suffering from mental illness. Attorney Daniel Coleman stated that his client was unable to control his actions due to a severe mental disorder. He presented the expert opinions of 2 psychiatrists who diagnosed Kyle with pedophilic disorder and antisocial personality disorder. Coleman argued that Kyle needed treatment, not punishment. However, the prosecution presented its own expert opinion, which showed that Kyle was well aware of the illegality of his actions and was able to control his behavior. Psychiatric expert Dr. Michael Green testified that Kyle's actions were methodical and planned. He purchased the necessary tools and materials in advance. He thought out an alibi. He concealed his crime for months. All of this pointed to conscious, deliberate behavior. Melanie was unable to attend the trial. Her mental state prevented her from leaving the clinic or testifying. Instead, medical reports and police records of those who found her in the basement were presented to the court. The photos from the crime scene shocked the jury so much that 3 of them couldn't hold back their tears. The images of Melanie's emaciated body, empty eye sockets, and jars of eyeballs on a shelf were so horrific that many in the courtroom demanded a recess. The testimony of medical examiner Dr. Elizabeth Warner made a particularly strong impression. She described in detail the procedure Melanie had undergone. She explained that removing eyeballs without anesthesia causes pain that the human mind cannot fully comprehend. She said that Melanie probably experienced pain equivalent to having every bone in her body broken at once, and that pain lasted for an hour. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The jury deliberated for only 4 hours before returning with a verdict: guilty on all counts. Judge Robert Anderson announced the sentence on September 27, 2019. Although the prosecution sought the death penalty, Oregon state law and the moratorium on executions in place since 2011 made that impossible. But Judge Anderson made sure that Kyle White would never see freedom. The sentence was life imprisonment without parole, plus 340 years for the aggregate of his crimes. Kyle will be held in a maximum security prison in Salem, Oregon for the rest of his life. Kyle listened to the sentence without emotion. He didn't say a word. He didn't express remorse. He didn't ask for forgiveness. As he was being led out of the courtroom, one of the reporters shouted a question at him. Why did he do it? Kyle paused for a moment, turned around and said, "She shouldn't have gotten involved in my business." Those were his last public words. Melanie White spent almost 2 years in a psychiatric clinic in Oregon after the trial. She was treated with antidepressants and antipsychotics and underwent intensive psychotherapy. She learned to speak again, although her speech remained slow and quiet. She learned to eat on her own. She began attending group sessions with other victims of violence. But she was unable to recover completely. Blindness meant that she needed constant help to perform even simple tasks. The psychological trauma was so deep that she could not be alone in the dark or in enclosed spaces without having panic attacks. She often woke up in the middle of the night screaming, thinking she was still in the basement. Melanie's parents, Janice and Roger Lee, devoted their lives to caring for their daughter. They took her out of the clinic in 2021 and settled her in their home in Eugene, where they set up a room for her on the first floor. They hired a nurse and arranged for regular visits from a psychotherapist. Melanie learned to use a cane for the blind and mastered basic Braille. But her world remained forever shrouded in darkness.